My name is Johan Blumhart, Sales Engineer for WatchGuard Technologies. In this session, we're going to cover how to configure external identities for synchronization into AuthPoint as part of our MFA multi-factor authentication series. We're going to cover how to configure Active Directory along with LDAP, as well as Azure Active Directory. Let's jump right in. Before we begin, let's define what an external identity actually is. External identities connect to user databases to get user account information and validate passwords. With AuthPoint, there are two types of external identities. There's Active Directory / LDAP. Active Directory is the directory service database to store organizational base data. LDAP is the protocol used to talk to this directory service database. And then we have Azure Active Directory, which is Microsoft's fully managed cloud-based directory service database. In this chart, we show AuthPoint, Active Directory, and Azure overview and some of the features that are available. With the first row, we have on-premise Active Directory. We can see VPNs are supported, agent for Windows and Mac, IDP portal, non-Microsoft service providers like Salesforce and Jira, Office 365, RDWeb, Web, ADFS, and Authentication API are all available if you have on-premise Active Directory only. If you have on-premise Active Directory through Active Directory Connect and Azure Active Directory, these options are also supported across the board. Now, if you have Azure Active Directory with no Active Directory Connect, neither AuthPoint Gateway, you're going to have some deficiencies here. So with MS Chat v2, you're going to need validation using the Azure NPS extension. Office 365 does have a limitation, which we will discuss, and RDWeb requires on-premise Active Directory. And then Active Directory Federated Services is not applicable as it requires an on-premise Active Directory server. So as I mentioned, with Azure Active Directory disclaimer, how or why can't you use Office 365 without an on-premise Active Directory? This is actually a knowledge base article available on watchguard.com at 0000171106. If you find this article, you can click on these hyperlinks from that article. The question is, can users that are synced from Azure Active Directory use AuthPoint MFA with Office 365? The answer is users synced directly from Azure Active Directory can use almost any AuthPoint integration such as VPNs, cloud applications, remote access, and the logon app. However, at this time, Office 365 does not support AuthPoint MFA for users that only exist in Azure Active Directory, as they are not synced with a local Active Directory server. This is primarily because of a Microsoft limitation. So to explain that a little bit further, to authenticate users that only exist in Azure Active Directory, third-party MFA solutions such as AuthPoint must use a Microsoft feature called conditional access with custom controls. This feature started a public preview several years ago, but it was never made generally available. You can see by clicking on this link in the in the article. It links to that article. To use custom controls, third-party MFA solutions must be registered by Microsoft. In 2018, Microsoft announced they would not register any more MFA solutions. Microsoft does not recommend that customers use the custom controls feature, which is available now in a limited feature and no additional companies can sign up with that. On March 2020, Microsoft announced that this feature would not be made generally available. However, they do plan to offer a credentials management feature for third-party MFA solutions like AuthPoint, but there's not a set date for this. Again, there's a hyperlink for that blog post. To use AuthPoint or any other third-party MFA solution for Office 365, you must use an Active Directory server. If your Active Directory servers are synced with a local Active Directory server, you can successfully configure AuthPoint MFA for Office 365. And that can be done easily with, so this is a picture looking at some of your environments. We have a user, we have their devices, and they sign on. We have the Azure Active Directory infrastructure. And again, in this infrastructure only, you cannot tie in Office 365 into MFA solutions. However, what we can do is have an on-premise Active Directory, and then that one is connected through Azure Active Directory Sync. That one used to be an application called DirSync from Microsoft that got migrated over into Azure Active Directory Sync. So again, to synchronize Azure Active Directory with an on-premise Active Directory server, these are free tools. Again, with the slides, I will publish those as well. But you'll want to download Microsoft Azure Active Directory Connect and then configure AD Sync from there. Now, for the sake of this Firebytes agenda, we're going to look at Active Directory and specifically the protocol that communicates with Active Directory LDAP. We're going to verify that the gateway that we previously installed is still active. And if you aren't familiar with how to install that gateway, you can simply follow this bit.ly link to our other Firebytes session on installing the gateway. We're going to configure that external identity. We're going to create the Active Directory group and ultimately add that user to the Active Directory group, which will then be set up to synchronize those users from Active Directory into AuthPoint. Then we're going to take a look at Azure Active Directory. We're going to configure Azure Active Directory. This bit.ly link is perfect. It's a nice walkthrough, step-by-step on what needs to happen, but we'll complete those steps today so you can see them in action. We'll then pivot back to AuthPoint and configure AuthPoint. Then we're going to add a user to an Azure Active Directory group and also create that group first and then add that user to that group. And then ultimately, we will synchronize the users from Azure into AuthPoint. And as you can see, it'll be a very straightforward process and seamless. And if you haven't seen or checked out our series before, you can log on to www.youtube.com/WatchGuardNW. In there, we have a series called New to MFA, Start Here, that talks about the overview of the Azure AuthPoint overview and the management components. So as we look at those AuthPoint main components today, we are going to be focusing on this AuthPoint gateway. So again, this is the corporate network gateway. This is a piece of small, lightweight application that's installed on premise. This acts as an Active Directory LDAP synchronization, as well as authentication, verifying those passwords. So just as a reminder, none of your Active Directory users' passwords are getting synced up to AuthPoint. All those are remaining local within your infrastructure, and we're just verifying those with an Active Directory account. It is also acting as a radius proxy. So if you haven't checked out the other MFA, Firebytes series on MFA, on how to set up VPN resources, we are leveraging the radius proxy from there. Let's set up Active Directory as an external identity in AuthPoint. So to do that, we're going to follow these steps. The first step is verification of gateway installation. So we're going to pivot over into our AuthPoint instance here. If you're not familiar with how to get here or how to set up your account, feel free to check out our New to MFA series posted on our YouTube channel. I'm going to go in and configure AuthPoint. Now I did install the gateway previously under SSL VPN sessions, so that is what I'm referring to here if you need to go back and review how to install the gateway. So I do want to verify that my gateway is set up and is currently connected. The next step is to configure an external identity. So I'm going to pivot back into my AuthPoint instance, click on external identity, choose external identity type, LDAP as the protocol for communicating with Active Directory, and then click on add external identity. From here, I'm going to type in the information here. Now it wants a search base. So as I look at my domain or my Active Directory users and computers and my domain name information, you can pull up your users and computers. So I can see my domain for this instance is logifuse.com. Now what it actually wants is it wants this in distinguished format. So what I can do, came across a little tip or little tool earlier a few years ago. It's ADSI edit. What it's going to do is provide that full distinguished name format for you in an easy to use method. So as I see here, I have ADSI edit. I can simply right click, go to properties. Now, if you're really familiar with Active Directory, you obviously know that you could just type in DC equals and then comma DC. However, some of us don't work with Active Directory on a daily basis. So what we could do is just go to distinguished name, view that, and simply copy that out of here. I'm going to go ahead and paste it under LDAP search base. Now it wants a system account for us. Now in my scenario, my domain logifuse.com, I have my employees listed here, and then I have my user accounts as well. So what I could actually do from here is go in and say I want to create a new user. And if I said AuthPoint, let's go ahead and name this AuthPoint LDAP. Full name. Now I'm going to take out the spaces on these, and you'll see the reason for that. It becomes a lot more difficult to set up the system accounts when you have spaces in there. So I'm just, as I mentioned, going to take out spaces, and I'm going to type in a password here and verify that password. And again, this account is only to read the information within Active Directory. So at this point, I can go in and copy over my username here. I like to just rename it, copy, and then just paste it. Now, if it's not in your user's container or CN, you need to enable this option and type the full user's DN below. I'm going to type in the passphrase. I want it to synchronize every hour. And now we type in a domain name that we want to synchronize. Now in this case, we have attribute related to first name. Our defaults are good here for the most part. Just make sure that your email is mapped correctly. If you import users into AuthPoint without an email address, obviously we can't send them the token. So we want to make sure that's set up. And then I'm going to type in the server address. And I want to go ahead and select LDAP S as the most secure and default port of 636. So just to recap, we went in and typed in the name, search base. Now, if I wanted to limit my AuthPoint users within a certain domain, or sorry, a certain container, I could go under employees and simply right click and go to properties and select my distinguished name from there. And that would be the base of my search base. So that would be everything within there, and below I would search and not outside of this. But for this example, I want to select everything under my domain. Go ahead and click Save. And now what I want to do is go in and select my gateway and just tie that LDAP resource, external identity resource, to my gateway. So to do that, I click on Gateway, choose my gateway, and then now I can see LDAP, select my Firebytes LDAP gateway. Click on Save. Now I can go back to external identities and go ahead and just check that connection. Click on Check Connection. And I see here that I've successfully connected to the external identity. The next step from here is to create an Active Directory group. This group will be based on the users that you want to synchronize into AuthPoint. Now it's important to realize that when they are imported into AuthPoint, they're going to immediately receive an email that says activate their token, or asking them to activate their token. So it's important to realize that you have a user awareness training on the next steps for your general users before you implement this system-wide. Once I have the Active Directory group created, I want to go ahead and add a user into that Active Directory group. Now again, as we're looking at testing this, make sure that you start out with a small user group, because ultimately these users will get an email asking them to enroll, and we'll tie up AuthPoint licenses as well. Once I have the user set to the Active Directory group, I want to go ahead and synchronize those users. So let's get started. I have my external identity set up. I want to go ahead and pivot into my Active Directory users and computers. I have my users here. Now I want to create a new group for my users that I want to synchronize into AuthPoint. I'm going to go ahead and select AuthPoint_sync. Now I like to eliminate spaces in my group names, anything that deals with LDAP, because it is sometimes a pain to deal with spaces in LDAP. Click OK. And now what I want to do is go into my employees. And again, I want to roll this out on a limited basis first. So I'm going to first roll this out to Will Turner. I click on Will. Now the important thing to realize is that in order for him to get imported into AuthPoint, he needs to have an email address. So make sure that you have email addresses for your users. And then you can go into Member Of, click on Add, and then I'm going to simply click on AuthPoint_sync. That picks up, click OK. So now this user belongs to AuthPoint Sync. Now I want to tell AuthPoint and ultimately my gateway which Active Directory groups to sync and which resource group to set them up as. So under my external identity, I can either do advanced query where I select my distinguished name of that group, but it's far easier just click on Group Sync and go ahead and click on Add New Group to Sync. What it's doing now is it's pulling all of my Active Directory groups through the gateway, and then I want to go ahead and assign it this group of Firebytes demo. We did create this group in a subsequent Firebytes session, so if you are not familiar with how to create that, you can find that video and watch that tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and click on Save. Now, if I wanted to, I could add additional groups. Maybe I was splitting up managers versus clerks. I could do that through having multiple groups to sync here. So now what I want to do is go to my external identity, and I can simply click on Start Synchronization. It says, do you want to start a manual synchronization now? Now, if you recall, I had set that up for an hour, and that is the default synchronization. So if you didn't manually synchronize your users, you would actually have to wait an hour for that. And just to recap, so it does say the request to start the synchronization was sent to the gateway. But just to recap, I can go to External Identities, go Firebytes, LDAP, and this is where I would change that synchronization interval. But at this point, I can see up here that I have a new alert. I can see LDAP sync has finished, users created 1, users updated 0, and users quarantined as 0. Now, as I delete those users from AuthPoint, or excuse me, as I delete them from that group, they are going to go into a quarantine phase. So if I click on users, I can see that now I have a new user called Will Turner. It's set up to through LDAP, and it's pending token activation. Now, if I want to remove this user from AuthPoint, all I would have to do is go back to my Active Directory users, find that either that user or that group, and remove that access from that group. Click OK. And now the next time that it synchronizes, I could wait an hour, or I could say I want to start synchronization now. AuthPoint is going to communicate to that gateway and start the synchronization through the gateway. And if I click on users, I can see at this point, Will Turner is in a quarantine phase. And that is because on the last synchronization, LDAP has finished. And it's quarantined 1 user. So again, I can go in under AuthPoint, look at that user, and I can't delete a user until they are in a quarantine phase. And now this is kind of a safekeeping with AuthPoint to make sure that we don't lose their token. But if I wanted to, I can go in and say I want to delete this quarantine user. You can also go under General Settings, and you can say automatically remove quarantined users as well from here. So at this point, I want to go to Users, Will Turner, and go ahead and delete Will Turner's AuthPoint user. Now let's configure Azure Active Directory as an external identity in AuthPoint. To do this, we're going to follow this simple steps. We're going to configure Azure Active Directory. I have a bit.ly link there, and we will walk through step by step on how to do that. Then we're going to pivot over to AuthPoint and configure AuthPoint. Then we'll add a user to Azure Active Directory group, synchronize those users, and we should see them in AuthPoint. Let's go ahead and pivot over into our live environment here. So as you can see, I have the instructions from that bit.ly link set up on the left-hand side, and I'm logged into my Azure portal on the right-hand side. So the first step is I log into the Microsoft Azure portal. That's completed. I want to select Azure Active Directory service. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Under App Registrations, I want to go ahead and click on App Registrations and then click on New Registration. And then I'm going to label it Azure Firebytes Active Directory and go ahead and click on, it is a single tenant, so I chose that and click on Registered. Now what I want to do is copy this application ID value. We're going to need to create a Azure Active Directory external identity in AuthPoint, so we want to go ahead and copy this. Now the next step is under Manifest. We're going to go click on this, and this is going to bring up our manifest editor. So under Allow Public Client, we're going to want to change this to True. Click on Save. Let me scroll down a little bit. And then we're going to want to go to API Permissions. Click on Add a Permission. Select Microsoft Graph, which is the biggest tile. We want to go to Application Permissions. From there, we want to select the group Read All. So under group, we have Read All, as well as the user Read All permissions. And go ahead and click on Add Permissions at this point. Now, it might say that it needs user consent required, not granted for Logifuse. I'm going to go ahead and click on Grant Admin Consent for all accounts in Logifuse. Click on Yes. And now everything is happy. So from here, I want to click on Certificates and Secrets. And I want to go into New Secret. I'm going to type in Azure Firebytes AD, and I'm going to say keep the default of expire in 1 year. Click on Add. And now we have the client secret, but before I do that, I want to go in and add an external identity. So I'm going to pivot over to AuthPoint. So now I'm in AuthPoint for the Firebytes demo group, and I want to add an external identity. So I'm going to click on External Identities. I'm going to choose Azure Active Directory and click on Add External Identity. So in this case, I'm going to say Azure Active Directory. Now, if you recall, we had the application ID pasted on the, or copied to the clipboard. I'm going to go ahead and paste that on here. And for this, I'm going to add in a domain. So it is saying if you don't have your own custom domain, the default is, so I'm going to go ahead and type in the default for Logifuse. And then what I want to do is copy this to a clipboard. That's the client secret. And I'm going to go ahead and paste that on the client secret. Now, again, by default, it's every 1 hour. I could change it if I wanted to, but I can go in and manually sync that, so I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to go ahead and click on save at this point. And from here, I should be able to say Azure Active Directory, I want to check the connection. Azure Active Directory reach successfully. And I can go ahead, once I know that that is successfully connected, now I can choose the group. So what I want to do now is go back into my Azure Active Directory and create a group that I then want those users to participate in. And again, this group are going to be the users that are synchronized into AuthPoint. So I click on a new group. And I'm going to go at security, name of group. I'm going to say AuthPoint Firebytes. And click on create. Now it's creating the group. Now I can go into the group itself if I want to and add in members. Or what I can do is go back under my users. And go into the user this way and add them into the group as well. So I'm going to choose that user that's going in. Let's add another one real quick here. Let's just make sure that's saved. Go ahead and add Darth into this group. Now, once we have everyone added into that group, and again, I would highly suggest that you start with 1 or 2 users to ensure that you have that working, because as soon as these users are ported or imported into AuthPoint, they're going to receive that activation email. So it's important to note that everyone needs to have an email address and belong to that group. So if I look at this user, I see that he has a email address, as well as he's attached to this group that I will then configure to import into AuthPoint. So at this point, what I want to do is switched back into AuthPoint, and I want to click on New Azure Active Directory Group to sync. I'm going to go ahead and maximize this because I should be done in my other group. I now see that I have my AuthPoint Firebytes Active Directory group, and then I want to go ahead and assign all of those users into the Firebytes demo AuthPoint group. Click on save, and now I could add additional ones as well. But if you have any questions on groups and the resources and the access policies, feel free to check out those other videos that we have posted on our YouTube channel. So now I'm going to go ahead and click on back. I have Azure Active Directory in here, and I'm going to go in and say start the synchronization. It says the manual synchronization was successfully started. Now what I can do is go in under my users group, and I immediately see that these users are in a pending stage. They've been sent emails to start the token activation. And again, just like I saw that before, now I can click on this alert, click on Azure, and see that 2 users were created, 0 were updated, 0 deleted, 0 quarantined. Now, just like we saw with Active Directory, once those users are removed from Azure Active Directory, either deleted or removed from that group, they will then appear in a quarantine phase or position, and you could delete them out that way. But that's as easy as it is to set up Azure Active Directory with AuthPoint.